In this video, we will cover the TCP and UDP ports you should be familiar with for basic networking fundamentals. These are the ports and protocols I will cover in this lesson. You should become very familiar with the ports used by these protocols and understand what each protocol does. For example, if you are asked which service uses port 53, you should know that the answer is DNS. If you are asked which port is used for secure internet browsing, you should know that the answer is port 443. You also need to understand the difference between TCP and UDP communication. TCP and UDP are transport layer protocols, commonly associated with layer 4 of the OSI model. Nearly all network data communication uses one of these two transport protocols. TCP stands for Transmission Control Protocol. One way to remember TCP is that it provides more control over the transmission of data. TCP is connection-oriented, which means the devices on both ends must establish a connection before data is exchanged. This is done through a three-step process called the three-way handshake. First, host A sends a SYN packet to host B. Host B receives the packet and sends back a SYN-ACK packet. This lets host A know that host B received the original SYN packet and is willing to communicate. Finally, host A sends an ACK packet back to host B, which establishes the connection. TCP provides reliability by using features such as acknowledgements, sequencing, error checking, and retransmission. This helps ensure that data is delivered correctly and in order. TCP is best for applications that require reliable data transport, such as email, web browsing, and file transfers. For example, imagine receiving an email with missing sections or waiting for a large file to download only to find that parts of the file are missing. In many cases, that would make the message or file unusable. Because TCP includes these reliability features, it has more overhead than UDP. This can make TCP slower and use more bandwidth. UDP stands for User Datagram Protocol. UDP is connectionless, which means data can be sent to a host without first establishing a connection. There is no three-way handshake. With UDP, packets that are lost, damaged, or received out of order are usually not recovered or resent by UDP itself. This makes UDP useful for applications that need fast and efficient data transmission, especially when reliability is less important than speed. Examples include online gaming, voice calls, streaming music, and streaming video. If packets are lost during a live stream, it usually would not make sense to resend them, because by the time the missing packets arrive, the stream has already moved on. UDP is faster than TCP, uses less bandwidth, and has a smaller header. The UDP header is only 8 bytes. FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol. FTP uses the client-server model, which means one device acts as the client and another device provides the service as the server. FTP is used to transfer files between devices. A user may be allowed to connect anonymously, or the user may be required to enter a username and password before transferring files. FTP commonly uses TCP port 21 for controlled traffic. In active FTP, TCP port 20 is used for data transfer. By default, FTP is not secure. Usernames, passwords, and data may be sent in plain text unless additional security is used. Security can be added by using TLS or SSL. This is called FTPS, which stands for File Transfer Protocol Secure. FTPS can use ports 989 and 990, although explicit FTPS may also begin on port 21 and then negotiate encryption. SFTP, or SSH File Transfer Protocol, is another secure file transfer option. SFTP is not an upgrade to FTP. It is a separate replacement that uses SSH on port 22. SFTP encrypts both commands and data. SSH stands for Secure Shell. SSH commonly uses TCP port 22. SSH encrypts user authentication, commands, output, and file transfers. SSH also uses the client-server model. There are two major versions of SSH: version 1 and version 2. SSH version 2 offers better security and additional features, so it is the recommended version. SSH keys can be used to automate secure access and are often used for scripts, backups, and administrative tasks. SSH is a secure replacement for Telnet. For the exam, make sure you know that Telnet is insecure and that SSH is the recommended secure alternative. Telnet is a remote terminal protocol that commonly uses TCP port 23. It is used to open a command line session on a remote device. Telnet also uses the client-server model. A Telnet client requests command line access to a Telnet server, authenticates, and then can run commands remotely. The problem with Telnet is that its data is sent in plain text. Usernames, passwords, and commands are not encrypted. Because of this, Telnet is considered insecure and has largely been replaced by SSH. Telnet is disabled in Windows by default, but it can be enabled through Turn Windows Features On or Off in Control Panel settings. As a technician, you should be familiar with the basics of email communication. Nearly all users have at least one email account, and many users have multiple accounts from different providers. SMTP stands for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. SMTP is used to send email messages. It is used by email clients to submit outgoing mail and by mail servers to transfer email between servers. SMTP commonly uses TCP port 25, TCP port 587, and TCP port 465. Port 25 is traditionally used for server-to-server mail transfer. Port 587 is commonly used for email submission with Start TLS. Port 465 is used for email submission over implicit TLS. POP3 stands for Post Office Protocol version 3. POP3 is used to retrieve email from a mail server. It uses TCP port 110 by default and TCP port 995 for secure POP3 over TLS or SSL. In a traditional POP3 setup, messages are downloaded from the server to the local client and may then be deleted from the server. This allows messages to be read offline, but it is not ideal when a user wants to manage the same mailbox across multiple devices. Some POP3 clients can be configured to leave copies of messages on the server, but POP3 is still less flexible than IMAP for multi-device email access. IMAP stands for Internet Message Access Protocol. IMAP is another protocol used to retrieve and manage email from a mail server. IMAP uses TCP port 143 by default and TCP port 993 for secure IMAP over TLS or SSL. A major advantage of IMAP over POP3 is that IMAP allows email to be synchronized across multiple devices, such as a desktop, laptop, tablet, and smartphone. This is because messages usually remain on the server until the user deletes them. DHCP is a fundamental building block for understanding how devices communicate on a network. DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. DHCP is based on BOOTP, which stands for Bootstrap Protocol. DHCP uses UDP ports 67 and 68. DHCP servers use UDP port 67, and DHCP clients use UDP port 68. DHCP also uses the client-server model. A DHCP client requests network configuration information from a DHCP server. The DHCP server can then lease or assign an IP address and other network settings to the client. Home routers and gateways often act as DHCP servers by assigning IP addresses to devices on the local network. IP addresses can be assigned dynamically, automatically, manually through DHCP reservations, or statically on the device itself. Dynamic allocation means the DHCP server leases an available IP address from a pool for a specific period of time. Automatic allocation means the DHCP server assigns a permanent address to a client. Manual allocation, often called a DHCP reservation, means an administrator maps a specific client identifier or MAC address to a specific IP address on the DHCP server. Static configuration is when an administrator manually configures the IP address directly on the device without relying on DHCP. The DHCP process is commonly explained as a four-step process called DORA: discover, offer, request, and acknowledge. First, the client sends a discover message to search for a DHCP server. Next, the DHCP server sends an offer message with an available IP address and configuration information. Then, the client sends a request message to accept the offer. Finally, the server sends an acknowledge message to confirm the lease. It is important to understand how DHCP works for the exam and for troubleshooting basic network connectivity. DNS is another fundamental service that every technician should understand. DNS stands for Domain Name System and uses TCP and UDP Port 53. DNS is a hierarchical and decentralized naming system. This means there are multiple levels to domain names, and DNS data is distributed across many servers. DNS resolves host names to IP addresses. It can also support reverse lookups, which resolve IP addresses back to names. Data is transmitted over networks using IP addresses. When you type a web address into a browser and press enter, DNS helps translate the host name into an IP address so the computer knows where to send the request. DNS servers can be internal to an organization or public on the internet. On a Windows computer, you can view DNS server information by opening Command Prompt and typing ipconfig/all. DNS is often compared to the yellow pages of the internet. A domain name is like the name of a business, and the IP address is like the street address of that business. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol and commonly uses TCP port 80. HTTP is an application layer protocol that uses the client-server model. With HTTP, a client requests web pages or hypertext documents from a web server. These documents often contain hyperlinks to other documents or resources. HTTP is not recommended for sending sensitive data over the internet because the data is sent in clear text and is not secure. HTTPS stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure and commonly uses TCP port 443. HTTPS is the secure version of HTTP. It uses encryption to help protect the privacy and integrity of data transmitted between the client and the server. Most websites today use HTTPS as the preferred method for transmitting web traffic. HTTPS helps protect against attacks such as eavesdropping, tampering, and man-in-the-middle attacks. You can usually identify an HTTPS connection by the lock icon next to the web address or by seeing HTTPS at the beginning of the web address. RDP stands for Remote Desktop Protocol. RDP is a proprietary protocol developed by Microsoft. It allows users to connect to remote computers over a network using a graphical interface. RDP uses port 3389 by default. Traditional RDP uses TCP port 3389, and modern RDP implementations may also use UDP port 3389 for improved performance. Connections can be established by connecting to the remote computer's hostname or IP address. With a typical remote desktop session, the remote user's screen may lock or show a sign-in screen while the remote session is active. Remote assistance is different because it is designed for support scenarios. A technician may request permission to connect, or the user may send an invitation. The screen and control can be shared between the user and the technician. LDAP stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. LDAP commonly uses port 389. Secure LDAP, often called LDAPS, uses port 636. LDAP uses the client-server model. It is an open, vendor-neutral application protocol used to access and manage directory information. A directory service stores information about objects such as users, groups, computers, and other resources. Third-party applications can perform LDAP queries to validate users, search directory information, and retrieve object attributes. Examples of directory services that support LDAP include Microsoft Active Directory, OpenLDAP, and Apple Open Directory. SNMP stands for Simple Network Management Protocol. SNMP uses UDP ports 161 and 162. SNMP is used to collect and modify information about network devices such as routers, switches, printers, servers, and many other managed devices. Network management systems use SNMP to monitor and configure devices. SNMP queries typically use UDP port 161. Alerts sent from devices to administrators or monitoring systems are called SNMP traps, and they use UDP port 162. Some other protocols you should be familiar with are NetBIOS and SMB. NetBIOS stands for Network Basic Input/Output System. NetBIOS over TCP/IP uses ports 137 through 139. NetBIOS allows computers to communicate with each other over a local area network. NetBIOS services include name services, datagram services, and session services. NetBIOS name service uses UDP port 137 for registering and resolving names. NetBIOS datagram service uses UDP port 138 for connectionless communication. NetBIOS session service uses TCP port 139 for connection-oriented communication. SMB stands for Server Message Block. CIFS stands for Common Internet File System. SMB commonly uses TCP port 445. SMB is used for sharing files, printers, and other network resources. SMB often works with Windows file sharing and can also be used by other operating systems. SLP stands for Service Location Protocol. SLP uses TCP and UDP port 427. SLP is used to announce services and discover available services on a network. Services are organized using scopes, and devices generally discover services within the same scope. AFP stands for Apple Filing Protocol. AFP uses TCP port 548. AFP is Apple's file sharing protocol. It provides file-based services for Apple systems. In modern environments, SMB is more common for file sharing, but AFP may still appear in networking study material and legacy environments. This has been a Quickbytes education video. If you found this video helpful, click the like button below and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.